Today's scripture lesson comes to us from the Gospel according to Luke. Luke's Gospel is what we see a lot in year C of the lectionary. And we happen to be a part of it right now where we're going from saying to saying to saying. Last week we did the lost sheep, the lost coin, and skipped over the prodigal son. Today we're starting in the next chapter about the parable of the dishonest manager. It's not one of my favorites. And you'll know after I've finished reading it, I doubt if it's one of your favorites either. But we're going to look at it anyway. Here we go. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. Then Jesus said to his disciple, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought against him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' And the manager said to himself, 'What will I do now that my master has taken my position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig. I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do and how to do it when I am dismissed as manager, and that people may welcome me in their homes.' So he summoned his master's debtors one by one, and he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' And he answered, 30 jugs of olive oil. And he said, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. So he went from, 100 jugs of olive oil to 50, all right? And how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. And he said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. And I tell you, make for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that you, when it's gone, you may be welcomed in your eternal home. And whoever is faithful in very little will also be, and whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in very little is dishonest in much. And for some reason I can't read this. And if you have been faithful with dishonest wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? And if you have been faithful with what belongs to others, who will give you what you own? No slave can serve as two masters, for one will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The reason I don't like this passage in a lot of ways is because it sets up this hard bargain where we look at this parable and Jesus rewards this guy who's been unfaithful and been kind of conniving and deceiving. The passage that we read in the scripture doesn't give it full justice. So this guy has swindled out of his landlord, his owner, a vast amount of money. And so when he's talking to the guy about how much oil he owes, and he says, a jug of oil. Well, it's not like going to Costco and buying a liter. He's swindled this guy out. The jug represented about 40 gallons of olive oil, okay? So he's taken 400 gallons of oil and basically told the guy, well, just give me half of that and it's good. So what happened to the other 200, you might ask? Or the wheat is not just like a sack of gold medal flour. We're talking about bushels and bushels, like 15 bushels of wheat for one of these units they're talking about. So, and why does he give the guy with olive oil 50% off, but he only gives the guy with wheat, 20? I don't know, what's up with that? It seems to me that the story is very uneven in a lot of ways. And then Jesus says, well, look, the master was happy that he was able to manage all that, and he dealt shrewdly with the people he was owed. Now, commentators have bent over backwards in a lot of ways to try to make this a happy text, by saying, well, Jesus is really meaning this, and Jesus is meaning that, and because we can't put crazy talk in Jesus' lips. You just can't have Jesus talking about things, about the real world, in the way that people are dishonest with one another. There's got to be some golden lining to it all. The last commentary I read on this didn't have the golden lining. The guy just kind of saw the text as it was written and said, sometimes you have to be shrewd. And he believed that what Jesus was talking to with his disciples, remember, this is a text that's different. He's not talking to the outside world. He's talking to the inside world, to the disciples. He's saying, you need to be as shrewd as the people who are around you. You can't blithely go through life thinking that everything is just going to be great because you have faith in God. You got to be as shrewd as the people that you deal with every day. And in doing so, you have to look at the world a little different than everything's going to be okay mentality. Now, I think a lot of people do that anyway. I think people do it, but they kind of see that outside of their religious framework. With Jesus, we're supposed to love one another. We're supposed to all be happy together. We're all supposed to get along just great. We're supposed to have the love of Jesus in my heart. But the reality is the world that we live in isn't as loving as that is, or caring, or peaceful, or welcoming than we would like it to be. And a lot of people's attitudes is when we step off that pier, the loving pier, and into the real world, we're going to drown in the corruption of it. And therefore we need to just kind of stay on the pier and look out at the troubled water and say, that's troubled water, and we're just not going to swim in that, wade in it, touch it at all. We're going to let the world fall apart as we are above it all. It's a type of Christianity that is appealing to a lot of people because and we see it a lot in slogans, not of this world, that you're not part of it. I'm above it all. There's something about my faith that just raises me above above the tumult. But the reality is we live in the tumult of this age, don't we? There's no way that we can really cling or get ourselves or raise ourselves above the things that happen around us. It is foolish to think that the world will take care of itself without us really being involved. And therefore we can't, either through our faith or through our own closing our eyes to the world around us, insulate ourselves from the realities of life. All of us who have been sick over time know that our faith really didn't keep us from getting sick. Or those of us who've had things happen to us that we had foreseen, good or bad, it's really not our faith that brings that in or out. It's just the reality of the world that we live in, and the reality that we, no matter how hard we try, will get picked up every once in a while by the undertow of life and will deposit us in places that we haven't ever thought we would go or be or see. And so this parable of the dishonest manager kind of goads us, like some of the hard sayings of Jesus, to say that the world isn't as easy and peaceful, or God's world isn't as easy and peaceful as we'd like to make it out. It is full of hard times, and they're full of decisions that have to be made that make us uneasy. Now, I've dealt with people like this manager who thought they were doing me a favor by giving me a discount, but really they weren't. They were giving me something, but really what they were giving had strings attached. The dishonest manager said, well, I got to take care of myself. I'm going to lose my lucrative position here, and I got to find some way that I can be welcomed into these people who I once had a relationship with, which is very important in the ancient world. These ties were very, very important. And a lot of it had to do with the economics of things. If I did you an economic favor, then you were obliged to do that economic favor back to me. And so the person who was forgiven this huge amount, for example, of oil, he was kind of on the hook for this guy. And no matter if he was the kind of individual that he held his nose about every time he had to have dealings with him, it didn't matter, because he did the deal. And you were on the hook for it, and you had to get around it. I hope that you never have relationships like that. But invariably, we end up on the hook with people that we really don't really care so much about, whether it's a supervisor at work or a neighbor or someone else in our lives that comes in and does us, quote, a favor, and we're kind of there and know that that's not really a favor, but there will be something wanting for it at the end. What does this parable teach us about things like that? Do we hold our nose and say, okay, we'll take care of it, and yeah, I know I did you a favor, now I got to do you one to get back to level ground? Or is there something that we can glean out of this with our faith that says, maybe we're not just lowering ourselves to the standards of other people, even though we're caught in the axis of life? What I hope is that what faith gives us is a perspective that is beyond the moment, beyond the point where we're having to do what we're having to do, but at least gives us a sense that we do these things not because we're solely obliged to do it, but because we hold ourselves to a higher standard, and that higher standard is that we just don't negate our debts, or we just don't leave people in the lurch, or we just don't forget about the things that we owe others. But we give ourselves over, because of our faith, to go the extra mile, as the other parable of Jesus would say, to go the extra mile, to make sure that what we do has integrity, and that we, because we have faith, allows us to stand at the end of this process and say, it stunk all the way through, and I was able to get through it, and I took a shower, and I feel a whole lot better for myself for doing it, because I did follow through with what I said I was going to do. At the end of this parable, there's this interesting saying with Jesus, says, a slave can't have two masters. Well, in reality, in the world he lived in, yeah, they could. You could have two masters. You could buy a slave, two people could buy a slave and say, okay, I got you Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the other person has you the other days. And so the slave would swap back and forth all the time. And it was pretty obvious, if you had two, you probably made a favorite really quickly, just for your own, to protect yourself. But Jesus says you can't have two masters, really, because it's obvious. You're going to love one and you're going to hate the other. And then the last one is you can't serve both God and wealth. Well, that's a theme all the way through Luke. From the very beginning to the very end, we see the interchange between the wealthy and the poor over and over and over in Luke. And in Luke's gospel is an avocation for the poor. And so these sayings come up all the time, where you have these class struggles up and down. And for Luke's gospel, Jesus is always advocating for the poor. And therefore, God advocates for the poor. When we advocate, when we give ourselves over to God's work in our lives, we are advocating for justice. We are advocating for the poor, I guess. We're advocating for our own self-reliance, and we're also advocating for our own integrity in what we live for and what we do in the world. It's important to remember that no matter where we are in life's journey, even in situations that we would rather not be in, we have a part to play, and the way that we act as actors in life makes a difference in the outcome of things. If nothing more than for our own psyche, it does make a difference, and it can make a difference for the world around us. For these Filipino laborers that we see on the screen before us this day, their lives were dreary and no one seemed to care. They lived in a very racist time, as racist as it is today, but a different way. And here they are at the end, sitting on the back of their truck where they were loading lettuce. Someone cared about them. They didn't have to, and they happened to be members of this congregation. But somewhere along the way, someone saw some injustice that was being done to them, and they decided to make a difference. We have that potential, even today, to make a difference in an unjust world. And we can, through Christ's love, continue on what has started long ago, making life better and finding our faith in the process. Amen.